You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast hosted by two women who never met in real life, and that's all we can say about that.
Before we start, we want to say a very sincere and genuine thank you to our Patreon members. This show exists because you support it, not just financially, but by sticking with us through very long episodes, obscure history, and deep rabbit holes full of fun facts, or unfun facts, as we so often call them. If you want ad-free early access and bonus content, Patreon is where that all lives. Thank you so much, all of you, for keeping Fresh Hell going. And welcome to our newest Patreon member, Lonnie's. Looking forward to getting to know you in our monthly chats and get-togethers.
Now it's time to finish our three-part series about Friedrich II, King of Prussia, Friedrich the Great, or der alte Fritz, the old Fritz. Fritz is the short form for Friedrich, in case you don't know, and I think that's also, well, I know that's also where this thing comes, where English speakers called German soldiers Fritz, right? If you haven't listened to the first two parts, please, we urge you, please, we beg you, do that first. If you already listened but need the quickest of reminders of where we're at, Annie, could you please?
Of course. All right, let's see. This was all new to me, so I'm loving this whole series. So when Friedrich Wilhelm I took the throne, Prussia was geographically awkward, economically limited, and frankly, not very glamorous. And he responded to that reality in the most Friedrich Wilhelm way possible by turning the state into a hyper-disciplined, hyper-frugal military machine. He cut court expenses to the bone, despised luxury, hated music and philosophy, and expected his heir to be a miniature version of himself. The problem was that his son, Friedrich II of Prussia, was very much not that. Young Friedrich loved books, languages, music, and French culture. He played the flute, he wrote poetry, he gravitated toward people who shared those interests, and from a very early age, this put him on a collision course with his father. Let's just say the family dynamics were grim. Public humiliation, frequent beatings, and constant surveillance. By 1730, Friedrich was exhausted, isolated, and increasingly desperate. His relationship with his closest friend, Hans Hermann von Katte, became central. Katte was Friedrich's confidant, and maybe his lover. Friedrich planned to escape to England, but failed. Friedrich Wilhelm I considered his son's actions desertion and treason. There were arrests, interrogations, court-martials. Friedrich himself was imprisoned, beaten, and genuinely feared a death sentence. Katte's fate was even worse. Despite a military court initially sentencing him to life imprisonment, the king intervened directly and forced a death sentence. Katte was executed in November of 1730, and Friedrich was probably forced to be an eyewitness of this execution. By the end of Part 2, Friedrich is alive, barely, but everything else is gone. His freedom, his illusions, his closest friendships. What survives is a young man who learns very quickly that open resistance will get him killed. And that brings us to Part 3.
So yeah, Katte was dead, but Friedrich was very much still alive and still in Küstrin. And I think we haven't told you how life there was for the treasonous crown prince. Küstrin wasn't just some random provincial town where Friedrich was sent to cool off. It was a fortress in I think the most literal sense of the word, sitting right at the meeting point of the Oder and the Warthe rivers. Küstrin was one of Prussia's key border locks. So if you controlled Küstrin, that meant you controlled the eastern approach to Berlin, to the capital. The town had been rebuilt in the 16th century as a very modern fortress city, very modern for 16th century, obviously. It had bastions, walls, controlled gates, all the razzle-dazzle, and there was also obviously a permanent garrison. 2 rooms in the president's apartment on the first floor of the newer palace wing were prepared for Friedrich, where he then was placed in aggravated solitary confinement. The cell was stripped down to the bare minimum, which meant a bed, a table, a few chairs, a chamber pot, a candle holder with 1 single tallow candle, and 3 religious books. There were no other comforts, he didn't have any privacy, and he was not allowed to have any conversations with other people. And above all, there was no trust, because Friedrich Wilhelm I was obsessed with the idea that his son might try to escape again. So the windows were barred from the outside, and guards were reinforced throughout the fortress. The civilian movement in town was strictly monitored, and a full company of troops was transferred from another fortress to strengthen the watch. The daily routine was regulated down to the minute, and that's something we already saw when Friedrich was a child. He has a daily schedule minute by minute, not hour by hour.
Right.
The door to the cell was locked with not 1, but 2 large padlocks, day and night. The governor held the keys. At 8 in the morning, 2 officers unlocked the door to inspect the room. A guard brought water for washing and removed the waste in the chamber pot. The entire process was not to exceed 15 minutes. Then the door was locked again. Meals were delivered at noon and at 6 in the evening. No knives, no forks were allowed. Everything was cut up beforehand. The door was opened only 3 times a day, never for more than for 4 minutes, and always in the presence of 2 captains who were explicitly forbidden from speaking to the prisoner. And if Friedrich asked questions, they were to ignore him. But you know how it is, not everything always goes according to the king's plan. And the Kammerpräsident, and he was basically the highest civilian authority in the region. I was kind of looking up what the real word for, or the right word in English would be. I couldn't find it, but let's just say he's the highest civilian authority in that region of Küstrin. And he was a man named Münchow, and he was kind of deeply troubled by what he saw was happening to the king's son. He felt bad for him. And so his youngest child, who was an 8-year-old boy, he spoke French, and he was sometimes allowed into the cell to keep the prisoner company. Conveniently, the boy's mother dressed him in a long fur coat with very deep pockets, and inside he smuggled fruit and delicacies and letters in and out. You remember last week we told you he was able to write to Wilhelmina. That's how that worked. So there was, anything forbidden and desperately wanted sometimes could be brought in from the outside. Friedrich would never forget this kindness, because years later he would bring the boy to Berlin, he would see to his education and advance his career. The child who had slipped all the contraband into the prison cell would then grow up to serve very close to the king himself. Then, after Kate's execution, Friedrich was brought before a special commission, and there he swore unconditional obedience and loyalty to his father. Then he was given back his sword. He was once again permitted to wear the Order of the Black Eagle. Solitary confinement was formally ended and replaced with a simple fortress arrest. He was then moved into a rented house in Küstrin's old town, very close to the ramparts, and his household was kind of restored, but under very strict supervision. The new household marshal, a von Wolden, received a multiple-page instruction from the king detailing Friedrich's daily routine, again down to the teeny tiniest detail. Nothing was left to discretion, not his movements or his schedule, not who was allowed to contact him. And most importantly, Friedrich then was put to work. He was assigned to the Kriegs- and Domänenkammer, so the administrative heart of this province. And his father wanted him to learn that states are not built on glory or art or philosophy, but on accounting. Power depended on things like agriculture, taxation, livestock, fodder, fields. a ruler who does not understand economics will always be ruled by favorites.
So basically, Friedrich starts at the bottom.
Yeah, he was assigned to the mailroom first.
It's just that big squeaky cart. Trying to get it over the cobblestones. Oh no.
No, but he did learn about things like land management and grain supply and animal stock and all these fiscal reports. He wrote regular and detailed letters to his father describing what he had learned and suggesting improvements. And under the guidance of very experienced administrators, he very quickly grasped how much a state's strength depended on the economic basis.
And another thing happened. To keep him from sinking entirely into isolation, Friedrich was given a new companion, a 22-year-old musician named Michael Gabriel Fredersdorf. Officially an oboist, he also played the flute beautifully. With him, Friedrich began to make music again for the first time since his arrest. Fredersdorf would remain one of the most important figures in his life, eventually becoming his confidential chamberlain and closest companion.
Sorry for interrupting, but I think we need to talk a little bit more about Fredersdorf because he would really become the person Friedrich trusted with everything. With money, with who was allowed to have access to him, with, medical complaints, correspondence, even with his hemorrhoids. And I'm not kidding here, Friedrich wrote about his hemorrhoids to Fredersdorf very often. He was very troubled, apparently, by hemorrhoids.
I think that was a really common problem for everybody back in the day because
I think,
pre-understanding how diets worked, I think all of the old texts, like every time you start to get into researching old texts, someone's talking about hemorrhoids. So I feel like it is known, if you will.
Also, they probably sat around on cold stone a lot.
Yeah, everyone's
cold
sitting
chairs,
around on cold
stones,
rocks. Yeah. Nobody understands the importance of fiber in your system. It's fine. They've got bigger problems.
Friedrich definitely has bigger problems.
Yeah.
Fredersdorf controlled who got to see the king and who didn't. He managed Friedrich's finances, his private finances, that is, his personal household, all the art purchases. He ordered artists and instruments, and he handled everything that was sensitive and private and secretive. And he pretty much built what amounted to an early internal security system around the king. Well, when he was the king then later. Voltaire, who was invited to Friedrich II's court regularly, he would later call Fredersdorf le grand factotum du roi Frédéric, so the king's everything man. Another contemporary simply called him the real prime minister. So you see that he has his little finger, basically, I think, or kind of this.
He knows.
There's a lot of influence. Yeah. And yet, for a very long time, Fredersdorf barely appeared in the official story of Friedrich the Great. And he didn't have really a high position. He was not like a minister or something like that. He was a chamberlain, that's it, but very, very influential. It's almost as if he had been erased from the history. We do know Friedrich loved him, he said so himself. He said it in a letter written on the eve of a battle. Friedrich confessed to his brother that Fredersdorf was one of the 6 people he had loved most in his entire life. And we also have letters between Friedrich and Fredersdorf. They exist, I think around 300 survived or are at least known by content. And they portray Friedrich as a man who was very worried, very affectionate. He was teasing him. He was sometimes really needy, sometimes desperate. So very, very normal human expressions, I think. Friedrich promises he would help Fredersdorf, quote, as long as I have life, end quote. And that he kisses the doctors who treat Fredersdorf well. And he worries obsessively about Fredersdorf's health. I think he had a lot of health issues. Friedrich begs Fredersdorf to rest and warns him about quack physicians. He sends remedies, he sends him scarves and, all the things he encounters when he's traveling around and thinks, that could really help Fredersdorf. And, of course, the same question as with Kate, were they lovers? And many historians think, yeah, at least early on they were. And again, we just don't know for sure. What we can say safely is that also this relationship was very intimate and emotional. Voltaire, and we know Voltaire was neither subtle nor kind, suggested Fredersdorf had, quote, served Friedrich in more than one way, end quote.
Oh, good old Voltaire.
Yeah.
I think, I think it's, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I think it's one of those things where it's very possible that they did intentionally erase aspects of this relationship from history because this was a time and place where homosexuality would have been a character flaw or a weakness or something to potentially maybe be ashamed about,
I also think, and what I read, the Nazis were very much like they put Friedrich Wilhelm and Friedrich II kind of as they wanted to present themselves as the successor of Friedrich II, the man who kind of made this big Prussian empire, who built it by war. And there was one high Nazi official who was gifted letters from Friedrich to Fredersdorf, I think, as a birthday present. And they liked these letters because Friedrich also had his flaws. He was against slavery, for example. He was for religious tolerance, but he was also kind of anti-Semitic. So the Nazis enjoyed that aspect very much. But I also think once they read probably about this more tender side the king had for his chamberlain, maybe that's why they kind of wanted to
erase.
I don't know when this erasure happened, probably over time, but I think that also plays part. That's what I want to say.
That makes sense. And it also paints a real picture, for me anyway, you've painted a real picture for me as of Friedrich II being this intensely, especially when you compare him to his father, who is like a stone cold, feel nothing, show no emotion, kind of person. Yeah. Friedrich seems incredibly sensitive and attuned. He's into poetry and music. That's, as soon as you know that this is somebody who feels things on a deeper level, probably on a level his father couldn't even comprehend. And then, I think when someone like that is then sort of tortured, the person he loves is killed in front of him, he's held in solitary confinement, a lot of it comes down to the fact that Fredersdorf came into Friedrich's life when he was desperately needed in order to sort of survive, Yeah. I think.
Yeah. I think so too, yeah. And then once Friedrich became king in 1740, Fredersdorf's rise was kind of, he was so successful on a more private level, on a more, he was the man behind the king.
That's right.
I don't know how to...
No, that makes total sense.
Yeah, and Friedrich ignored the social rank and he gifted him an estate. And Fredersdorf obviously became extraordinarily wealthy, not through corruption exactly, but, through all the royal favors, through all the people who needed something or wanted something done. He also had business ventures and access no one else had. He founded breweries. He owned a brick factory. He invested in overseas trade. He even dabbled in alchemy. On paper, officially, he was a servant, basically a servant. And in reality, people, including the queen, the wife of Friedrich, wrote to him, to Fredersdorf, to get things done. But also, we're not really there yet, because now, at this point, Friedrich is still pretty much the shunned crown prince, and he's trying to get back on his father's good side.
The real turning point for Friedrich, though, came in August of 1731. On his birthday, Friedrich Wilhelm passed through Küstrin. For the first time since the big fallout, father and son were brought together again. Friedrich throws himself at his father's feet, just overwhelmed, and the king forgives him, and he embraces him. And from that moment, the restrictions slowly start to ease up a bit. Friedrich was allowed to leave the fortress in the afternoons. He visited nearby estates, and he began cautiously to recover something like an emotional balance. And then, in November 1731, Friedrich was allowed to return to Berlin to attend his beloved sister Wilhelmina's wedding. She was married off after years of pressure, broken engagements, emotional blackmail, and outright cruelty from their father. So she's married off to Frederick, the Margrave of Brandenburg-Bayreuth.
Bayreuth. And Bayreuth that's actually where Richard Wagner had his estate and where to this day every year the Wagner festivities are held.
Oh, nice.
Bayreuth, yeah.
So Brandenburg Bayreuth?
Bayreuth. Mm-hmm.
Bayreuth, okay. It looks like Beirut. Ruth with a TH at the end, not like Beirut, Lebanon, like Beirut.
Yeah.
Like how okay. The marriage itself was not unhappy per se, but it was profoundly disappointing. Bayreuth was small, provincial, and intellectually stifling compared to what Wilhelmina had hoped for. Her husband was decent enough, but limited. But don't worry too much. Wilhelmina turned things around. She became a cultural force in Bayreuth, promoted music, philosophy, and architecture, and built a court that reflected the life she had always wanted. And she stayed close with her brother Friedrich, at least via letters.
So soon after Wilhelmina's wedding, Friedrich was readmitted into the army, and on 26th of February 1732, Friedrich left Küstrin for good, and he would never set foot in that fortress again. He called it his galley, so a place of forced labor, discipline, and suffering, and the most bitter years of his life, but also the years in which he became an adult. He was 20 at the time.
So young.
Yeah, it is
to go through all of that.
Yeah. He stayed in Küstrin for 2 years, basically. Well, not the whole 2 years, 1.5 years. But still, it's a long time.
That's a long time.
And then another thing happened. Friedrich married. He finally agreed to marry the woman his father had picked for him, Elisabeth Christine von Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel-Bevern. She was 16 at the time. She was born on 8th of November 1715, a princess from a large and very close-knit family. She had 8 brothers, 5 sisters. She lived or grew up at a comparatively modest court, and by all accounts, she had a rather happy childhood. In 1731, Friedrich Wilhelm I began negotiating a marriage contract with her father. Friedrich's mother, we already told you in episode 1, so Sophie Dorothea, she had wanted an ovarian match, so someone from the English connection, the so-called English party. I think at one point she was actively pushing for King George II's daughter, Amalie, to be married to Friedrich. But Friedrich Wilhelm was not interested in any of that. He refused. He wanted a German bride aligned with imperial interests and politically rather safe and also ideologically correct. And so Elisabeth Christine fit perfectly. For Friedrich, the marriage was not about happiness. It was his duty. It was about obeying his father. He wanted to make sure to never anger his father again. And so he agreed and did so without pretending otherwise, because he described Elisabeth as a quote-unquote poor thing or very poor person. So he felt kind of sorry. And because he made it absolutely clear that while he would obey and marry her, he would never love her.
And some say romance is dead. That poor woman. So many of us were brainwashed into thinking, though, that the ultimate goal was to marry a prince, right? And then the older you get, you see what that all comes with. And it's really not all that, is it?
No.
No,
the brothers Grimm and Disney are to blame, though, I think.
Yeah, right?
Anyway, Friedrich and Elisabeth, they met for the first time in March of 1732. Friedrich was this slim, rather fashionable man, and he was very conscious of his presentation. Elisabeth was blonde, blue-eyed, slightly taller than him, and his verdict was, well, she's neither pretty nor ugly. But at least he praised her good heart. But then again, he added another time, I will never be able to love her. The marriage contract was finalized on 11th of June 1733, and the wedding followed the next day at Schloss Sanssouci. That was the beginning, and in many ways it was already the end again. To this day, historians still argue about whether the marriage was ever even consummated. The sources are kind of evasive. Friedrich himself later remarked, though, that his wife was attractive enough and that she had no reason to complain that he didn't love her at all. And he added then he truly didn't know why they had no children. And I'm just reminding you of last week that there is the speculation that Friedrich was infertile due to an STD. Anyway, we all know how much of a big deal it is that there were no children.
Yeah, not only no son, but not even a single teeny tiny promise of a bebe. Like nothing.
No.
Just I really wonder what she can't complain I don't love her at all meant, because I do wonder whether this was even ever like I tell her I love her once a month. So
if the best thing you can expect of your husband is him telling you neither pretty nor ugly,
I mean,
we're gonna get to it, but he has so much more to say about her in later years, which is like,
I know.
charming.
And also like how much were women prepared by their mothers for things? Like she might not have any idea that anything. Yeah. Who can say?
So 2 weeks after the wedding, Elisabeth moved to Berlin. The only problem there was Friedrich did not. There was no shared household. She lived at the Kronprinzenpalais, so the palace of the crown prince, which is in Berlin, unter den Linden. And he stayed with his regiment in Ruppin. He visited rarely. She wrote letters and played cards and, enjoyed court gossip. She also had to navigate the moods of her formidable mother-in-law, and she never complained. Never. The king, however, did.
By 1736, Friedrich Wilhelm I had had enough. There was no heir, no visible progress, no appearance of a functioning marriage. Because, after all, if you're hoping for grandchildren and your son suddenly moves his wife to a different household, it's not looking good for grandchildren, is it? So he orders the couple to move to Rheinsberg together. And interestingly, this was the closest they ever came to sharing something resembling a shared life. At Rheinsberg, Friedrich created what would later become his preferred model of existence, a muse's court: music, philosophy, conversation. Elizabeth was treated with courtesy, even respect, and years later, she would remember Rheinsberg as a genuinely happy time, because despite everything, she loved and admired him. In 1740, Friedrich Wilhelm I dies, and Friedrich becomes king. Almost immediately, he left for war. Elizabeth moved into the Berlin palace, but not as the leading woman of the realm. That role belonged to Sophie Dorothea, now officially the Queen Mother. Elizabeth Christine was sidelined. She received an annual allowance of 40,000 thalers. In purchasing power, that's probably around 3 to 6 million euros per year, conservatively. So with some historians even arguing 8 to 10 million euro a year to live on, we're talking horse on heirloom carpet with a Belgian racing pigeon chilling on its head money, right?
Eating croquembouche.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't forget the croquembouche.
The croquembouche. Yeah, that's a lot of money. And Elizabeth,
that's a lot of money.
Her husband would live separately for the rest of their lives. They remained married on paper for decades, but would never share a life again.
Do you feel sorry for her, or do you think, well, I mean, at least she, had a leisurely life?
I think, both. I think both. I think that based on how abusive his own father was toward everyone, I'm glad that he wasn't physically cruel to her, it doesn't seem. And that would have certainly been the norm for lots of women at that time. Women had very little protection or power or anything. So it definitely could have been worse. The thing I keep thinking about is it's not like he hates women. We know that he adores his sister. What was that?
I'm like,
Is he kind of shitty toward all women?
I think he loved maybe 2 women in his life. I think he loved his sister and his mother.
Yeah.
I think he was at best neutral, and at worst, I think he didn't want to have women around him.
Okay.
That's just how I picture it. It's
so
not like not. He was not outwardly cruel or more sexist than other men in this period.
Sure. I just wish he could have been kinder to her, but But based on his own upbringing, I don't know where that well would have come from.
Yeah.
Like, how do you learn to be kind to other people when you've got Friedrich I as your...
I mean, surprisingly, I'm very surprised that he was able to be kind to certain people in his life. Very kind, very, yeah.
He had it in him.
Also to animals, but he definitely had it in him. What I do want to say is I read nothing about it, right? That's just me thinking.
Yeah.
If she ever had some indiscretion, some affairs going on, and I really hope she did and was not alone this whole time. Yeah.
Agreed.
I can imagine he would be the kind of husband who would be like, well, I have my life with my friends, and you have your life, and I'm looking the other way. As long as you keep it discreet, right? I don't think he would be this kind, no, treason, and put her into a convent or something like this, into a nunnery.
Right. Yeah, I keep thinking of Anne of Cleves. Like, you know what? In the end, you kind of got away pretty good. Mm. Like, you had your own estate, you had a lot of money, you had a certain amount of your own agency in your own life, and for a woman at that time, it could have been a whole lot worse. It doesn't mean it's ideal, but it's all relative, I guess, isn't it?
And I have a couple of other quick additions to the marriage. So in 1757, Queen Mother Sophie Dorothea passed away, and suddenly someone had to handle the representation in Berlin. And Friedrich was almost never there, and he had no interest in that part of a king's life. So Elizabeth took over, and there were balls nearly every week, and receptions and dinners and music and dancing, all this tralala. Kind of court life Prussia hadn't really had under Friedrich Wilhelm, and also not under Friedrich. Contemporary observers noticed immediately that Elizabeth is more talkative than necessary, whatever that means. Others say she was excessive in her enthusiasm. And the verdict was usually the same. She was fundamentally a very good-hearted woman, but not one who was a match for her husband. Friedrich made absolutely no effort to pretend otherwise. He rarely attended her events. He did not support her publicly. And perhaps most telling of her, and I felt really bad when I read it, there were no celebrations for their milestones. There was not a celebration for their silver wedding anniversary in 1758, and also not one for their golden anniversary in 1783. So 50 years of marriage and no acknowledgement of it at all publicly for a royal couple.
Yeah.
He did acknowledge something else, though. On 30th of March 1763, Friedrich and Elizabeth encounter each other for the first time in 7 years. 7 years without seeing one another. And Friedrich looks at her and says, "Madame, you have gained weight."
No.
But wait, there's more.
Oh, no.
Another 7 years later, Elizabeth was invited to a dinner in honor of Friedrich's sister Ulrike's 50th birthday. And at the table, Friedrich is sitting there, gesturing towards his wife, and remarks to his table neighbor, "That's my old cow whom you already met."
Wow. Wow. I mean, he obviously learned this sort of stuff from his dad, right?
I have no idea.
Speaking of that old coot, Friedrich Wilhelm I died on the 31st of May, 1740, and the soldier king was gone. Suddenly, Friedrich II of Prussia was king. He was 28 years old. Almost immediately, Friedrich signaled a complete reversal of his father's style, where Friedrich Wilhelm I was loud, suspicious, punitive, and aggressively moralistic. The new king presented himself as calm, cultivated, and intellectually open. Musicians returned to court. Philosophers were welcomed. French was spoke openly again. Voltaire was courted, literally and symbolically. The message was loud and clear. This is not my father's Prussia. And so within weeks, Europe was super excited. Diplomats reported that Prussia had transformed from grim barracks state into something resembling an Enlightenment salon with an army attached. Friedrich abolished torture in most cases. He relaxed censorship. He spoke openly about religious tolerance, famously declaring that everyone should get to heaven in their own way. But while Europe was applauding his taste in music and philosophy, Friedrich was doing something else behind their backs. He kept his father's army intact, every regiment, every reform. He retained the hyper-efficient bureaucracy. He did not dismantle the state his father had built. He simply wrapped it up in silk. European observers saw a philosopher king and assumed a pacifist. They saw tolerance and assumed restraint. They saw culture and assumed compromise. And they were all wrong. So very wrong. Wrong.
Wrong. And within months of his accession, Europe would learn just how misleading that first impression had been. Barely 6 months after he became King of Prussia, on 16th of December 1740, he launched what would become the First Silesian War. And I talked about it in past episodes, but for those of you who haven't listened to those yet, it all started with the death of Emperor Charles or Karl VI of Habsburg, who had left no male heir. His daughter Maria Theresia succeeded him on the basis of the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which was a legal arrangement meant to secure the Habsburg inheritance. But just because the leading men of Europe had promised Karl that they would take the Pragmatic Sanction seriously, didn't mean that they wouldn't try to get a piece of Austrian cake.
Oh, cake. Now I want Austrian cake. I really do need to come visit you.
We have great cake.
I've
Not
heard.
Sachertorte though, that one sucks. It's not juicy, but you know what was? Listen to that segue.
Yeah.
Sachertorte is not juicy. It's dry as Sahara sand. You know what is juicy though? Silesia, because that was the juiciest, sweetest piece of all. It was wealthy, had a big population, it was strategically valuable, and Friedrich moved quickly, invaded, and won his first major battle at Mollwitz. That victory encouraged others. Bavaria, Saxony, and then eventually France followed Prussia's lead, turning what had begun as a limited conflict into the War of the Austrian Succession. And while the war expanded around him, Friedrich did not pursue grand ambitions. He simply secured his objective, Silesia, and then he exited, like, I have my peace, see ya, thank you. In the Treaty of Breslau from 1742, he obtained Silesia as a sovereign possession and withdrew from the anti-Habsburg coalition entirely. And when the military balance shifted again in Maria Theresia's favor, Friedrich feared for his new acquisition. He didn't want to give up Silesia, not that easily. So in 1744, he re-entered the war, ostensibly to protect the Bavarian emperor, but in reality, he just wanted to secure Silesia permanently. He then invaded Bohemia, he broke previous arrangements in the process and reinforced his reputation as an unreliable partner. The campaign failed, but battlefield victories in Silesia allowed him to force the Treaty of Dresden from 1745, which once again confirmed Prussia's hold on Silesia. And then in 1744, Prussia acquired East Frisia through inheritance, a development Friedrich's father had anticipated decades earlier. And then when the last ruler of the House of Zirkenza died childless, Friedrich asserted Prussia's claim under the Emden Convention and occupied the territory without any resistance. And then the region swore allegiance within weeks. Then came the war that would define him, because in 1756, Friedrich launched a preemptive strike into Saxony without a declaration of war, initiating the 7 Years' War. He acted on intelligence that he had received that Austria, France, and Russia were coordinating an attack on Prussia. Whether this coordination was imminent or merely probable didn't matter to Friedrich. He just wanted to strike first. Friedrich personally commanded his armies, winning spectacular victories at Rossbach and Leuthen in 1757, cementing his reputation as a military genius. But he also suffered devastating defeats at Kollin, Hochkirch, and most disastrously at Kunersdorf in 1759. And then Kunersdorf kind of broke something in him, because in a letter written immediately after the battle, Friedrich described an army reduced from 48,000 men to barely 3,000. That's all, 3,000 effective soldiers left. and he wrote that he would not survive the ruin of his country, and he ended the letter with a farewell, and some historians read this as him considering suicide, at least for a brief moment. After all, Prussia now stood on the brink of annihilation. Only the failure of Austria and Russia to exploit their victory saved him. Their withdrawal became, in Friedrich's words, the, quote, miracle of the House of Brandenburg, end quote. The turning point came in 1762 with the death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth of Russia, and her successor Peter III admired Friedrich, and he ended the war, and he very briefly became his ally. Peter was soon overthrown, Russia did not re-enter the conflict, the coalition collapsed, England had already made peace, and in 1763 the Treaty of Hubertusburg ended the war and restored the territorial status quo, including Prussia's hold on Silesia. So Friedrich had survived. But you know who hadn't survived? Roughly 900,000 to 1.4 million people who had died during the 7 Years' War. That's 600 to 900,000 military deaths, which include the soldiers killed in battle, obviously, but also the ones who died of wounds, disease, exhaustion, or starvation. This is a not-so-fun fact. Disease killed far more soldiers than combat, which was typical for 18th century warfare. Then also at least 200 to 500,000 civilian deaths, and these people died from famine, epidemics, forced requisitions, destroyed harvest, and population displacement. Central Europe, so especially Saxony, Silesia, Brandenburg, also parts of Bohemia, were hit particularly hard. In some regions, entire villages were wiped out, never recovered demographically. For Prussia specifically, the losses were unbelievable. Around 180 to 200,000 Prussian soldiers died, and that was roughly 10% of the entire population. Some age cohorts of men were effectively erased at that time.
When the war ends in 1763, Friedrich is 51 years old and completely worn down. Prussia has survived, but just barely. Whole regions are depopulated, the treasury is wrecked, agriculture is in ruins, and the army is a shadow of what it once was. Nobody is in the mood for a victory parade. Friedrich doesn't even go to Berlin first, but he goes back to work. The first years after the war are grim and practical. He spends the 1760s doing what he had learned in Küstrin decades earlier, repairing the state. Grain imports, rebuilding villages, tax relief in devastated regions, debt restructuring, resettling empty land, encouraging immigration. This is where the administrator king shows most clearly. And it's only after Prussia is stabilized does the other Friedrich fully reemerge. So, let's talk about Sanssouci. Even the name says it all, Sanssouci, without worry. Sanssouci is a palace, but it's not the kind most people imagine when they hear that word. It's a relatively small summer residence built in Potsdam, about 25 kilometers southwest of Berlin, close enough to the capital for business, yet far enough to feel like a refuge. Potsdam itself had become a royal residence city, quieter and more controlled than Berlin, and Sanssouci sits on a hill at its edge, overlooking vineyards and parkland. Unlike Versailles or the Berlin City Palace, Sanssouci was never meant to impress a court or host ceremonies. Friedrich designed it as a private retreat, a place for a very small circle of hand-picked guests, music, philosophy, and long walks in the garden. And his wife was not allowed to ever set foot in it, except for one time when she fled Berlin during the 7 Years' War.
So basically it's Friedrich's man cave, and there are no girls allowed because girls have cooties, right?
So many cooties. That's exactly how I'm imagining it. Like there's a handmade cardboard sign on the door. This all started in the early 1740s. So in August 1744, Friedrich ordered part of the area, the so-called Fürstenberg, to be transformed into vineyards. 6 broad terraces were carved into the south-facing slope, curved inward to trap sunlight and optimize for growth. Walls alternated between espaliered fruit trees and glazed niches for exotic plants. Oranges stood in tubs between U pyramids. Sounds amazing. Sanssouci was designed to discipline nature gently, not dominate it violently. And at the very top, the house itself. Friedrich insisted on a maison de plaisance, not a representational residence. No raised podium, no grand staircase, no symbolic elevation above the world. He overruled his architect, Georg Wenceslas von Nobelsdorf, again and again. He wanted a single-story building set directly into the hill, with doors opening straight onto the terrace. Indoors and outdoors were meant to flow into one another. Sanssouci is small because Friedrich wanted it small. Sanssouci was where Friedrich could exist without performance. There he played the flute every day. He composed, rehearsed, corrected. He argued philosophy at dinner, and then he walked the terraces with his dogs.
Yay, we can finally speak about the dogs. I'm so happy.
It's dog time. Yes, and all of the other animals. This part is good.
Yes, we have to remember that Friedrich lived in a world where cruelty to animals was completely normal. In the 18th century, animals were generally not seen as moral beings. They existed to be used. You either use them for labor, or for food, or for entertainment, or status. And cruelty toward them was socially acceptable, largely. Don't get me wrong, we still, to this day, have a long way to go. But back then, more so. René Descartes, the French philosopher, had argued in the 17th century that animals were essentially automata. Can you believe that? Basically complex machines that reacted to stimuli but did not truly feel pain or emotions or consciousness. If an animal screamed, that was likened to a machine squeaking when damaged. Hate it. Of course, not all European people thought like this, but way too many. And what that meant in practice was that hunting was not only about necessity, but it was also spectacle and entertainment. Aristocrats staged massive hunts designed to exhaust animals to death. The suffering was kind of the point. Public cruelty was common entertainment. Animals were burned, beaten, baited, forced into grotesque performances. There were, for example, bears dancing. Obviously, they were not dancing. They were put on hot plates, so they appeared to be dancing.
It's awful.
Domestic animals, like horses or dogs or cats, they were tools. Whips were used, spurs. They were overworked, and this was all standard, and nobody better than I, basically.
Yeah.
Cats, in particular, were widely despised. We talked about that in our cat episode, because they were associated with superstition, and there was public ritualized cruelty towards them. For example, public burning of cats. This was common. There were no animal protection laws in most of Europe. I think in all of Europe, none, zero. Veterinary medicine barely existed as a discipline. Sick animals were usually discarded and not treated because that's a waste of resources. Even people we now think of civilized or enlightened, because this is the era of enlightenment. That's why I say civilized. It's not like it's the medieval times. They were still very brutal, and sensitivity toward animals was frequently kind of interpreted as sentimental or feminine or weak and not a virtue. It's like a flaw. Friedrich didn't think like that at all. He didn't just dislike hunting, for example, he despised it. He called it crude, stupid, and spiritually empty. He refused any hunting invitations. He mocked people who were obsessed with hunting. He turned former royal hunting grounds, like for example the Berliner Tiergarten, the Berlin Zoo, into public parks and spaces where people could walk among animals instead of slaughtering them. That alone would make him already very unusual for the 18th century, but he went much further. He believed animals had feelings. He wrote that they had hearts, souls, and moral worth. His constant companions were animals, dogs especially, Italian greyhounds, very delicate but also very nervous little creatures who needed warmth and closeness and gentleness. Not exactly the kind of animal a Prussian war king was supposed to adore, right? But he adored them obsessively. They slept in his bed, they sat in his study while he worked, they followed him through palaces and across battlefields, And for example, leather balls lay scattered across Sanssouci because the dogs needed toys. It's just very relatable. All dog owners know exactly how that would have looked. If they shredded pillows, he laughed and let them shred pillows. If they were cold, he tucked them under his coat. During the Second Silesian War, Friedrich very nearly got himself captured while out on reconnaissance because he'd brought his favorite greyhound, Biche, with him. And the two of them ended up hiding together in a ditch beneath a bridge while enemy soldiers passed overhead.
I really love the image of a king crouching in the mud with his tiny little greyhound. You know, it's just like shivering ever so slightly because they always do. They're so cute.
So cute. Yeah. I think it comes as no surprise, given what we know of his life. He trusted animals more than people, and he openly said so. When a scholar once came to court and Friedrich's dog, Alcmen, jumped up happily to greet him, Friedrich immediately hired the man because he believed animals could judge character better than his advisors. When one of his dogs died, he grieved deeply. When Alcmen died in 1785, while Friedrich was away, he ordered her body be preserved in a special coffin and laid out in the library until he returned, and witnesses described him openly weeping when he saw her again.
It wasn't just dogs. He also loved his white horse, Condé, a gentle animal that he never used for hunting. Condé wandered freely through Sanssouci, eating fruit from bowls and from pockets. When servants complained that the horse was damaging tile, Friedrich didn't punish the animal, but berated the servants. He almost never used spurs, he hated whips, and he believed pain taught nothing but fear.
I think he would know about this.
He would, exactly. You know who he also, this reminds me of a lot, is Queen Elizabeth II. This thing where, not that she came from an abusive situation, more so this thing of being a royal child and no one being fit companionship. And so the only safe friends you ever really have are dogs and horses.
Yeah.
Friedrich even kept a monkey named Mimi, who he called his companion in solitude. Friedrich also founded Prussia's very first veterinary school. He supported early animal medicine. He issued decrees protecting plants and animals. He talked about caring for trees, fruit, vineyards, about watching things grow instead of destroying them. Granted, the irony that this comes from a man who expanded Prussia by means of years and years of war, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people, is not lost on us.
Yeah, Popart is perfect.
Nope. When Friedrich died in 1786 at the age of 76, his last concern was his dog, Superbe, lying beside him. His final request was simple: warm Superbe with cushions. He had also left instructions for his burial. No pomp, no cathedral, nothing like that. All he wanted was to be laid to rest on the terrace at Sanssouci, beside his beloved dogs. Just that. A king who had spent his entire life under control, asking for one final thing: to be left alone. Naturally, that did not happen, and it would take over 200 years for anyone to listen.
Yeah, because his successor Friedrich Wilhelm II, who was his nephew, remember he didn't have children, he ignored his wishes and buried him in the garrison church in Potsdam, right next to his father, Friedrich Wilhelm I, the soldier king, the man whose discipline, violence and control had shaped Friedrich's entire life. So even in death, Friedrich was placed back under his father's shadow. And there he stayed, side by side, father and son. Fast forward to the Second World War. By the early 1940s, Potsdam was under serious threat from Allied bombing, and the garrison church and the tombs inside it suddenly became a problem because the Nazis did not want those coffins destroyed, desecrated, or captured. So in 1943, the coffins were removed, secretly removed. Friedrich II and Friedrich Wilhelm I, they were moved first to bunkers and then ultimately hidden away in salt mines. The same places where paintings and manuscripts and art were stored. Dry, stable, bomb-proof, and apparently also very suitable for kings. So for the last years of the war, Prussia's most famous monarchs lied underground, sealed away in darkness while the world above them burned to the ground. After 1945, things did not get simpler. Germany was divided. Potsdam was in the east. Prussia itself was an awkward subject. It was, too militaristic, too monarchy, too complicated. And the remains of the two kings were separated. Friedrich Wilhelm I eventually made his way back to Potsdam, where his legacy as the architect of Prussian discipline fit more comfortably into all this military narrative. Friedrich II, however, did not return. His coffin ended up far away at Hohenzollern Castle in southern Germany. And for decades, that's where he stayed. It took the collapse of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany and more than 200 years for anyone to finally say, you know what, maybe we should listen to what he actually wanted. So on 17th of August 1991, on the 205th anniversary of his death, Friedrich II was at last brought back to Sanssouci. And that's where he was buried, on the terrace, exactly where he asked to be, near the names of the dogs he loved most. The 5 dogs that are buried next to him are, by the way, Bisch, Alcmain, Thisbe, Superb, Pax, and Hasenfuß. And Hasenfuß, I found that funny because Hasenfuß in German is how you call somebody who's easily scared.
Oh.
A rabbit's foot is somebody who's scared easily.
That's such a good name for a dog.
Yeah.
That would have been a good name for...
Imagine how he got this name.
Hasenfuß.
And it's so cute.
It's so cute.
Fun fact, people still leave potatoes on the grave of Friedrich. No, not flowers or candles. Potatoes.
Why?
Potato. Well, we mentioned it several times now. Friedrich had several nicknames throughout his life. He was Fritzchen when he was a child, and he was the Great. He was the Alte Fritz when he was an old man, but he was also the Potato King because he considered to be the ruler who saved Prussia from famine by introducing the potato as staple food. A bit of a problem, it's mostly a myth though, because potatoes were introduced and promoted in Prussia during Friedrich's reign, but they were not his personal pet project or anything like that. Not the result of some benevolent one-man potato crusade or something, The potatoes had already been known in German territories before Friedrich came to the throne, and their spread was very slow and often resisted because many peasants actually distrusted them. They didn't know how to prepare them properly. They simply refused to grow something that wasn't grain or that they didn't know. In German we have the saying, was der Bauer nicht kennt, das isst er nicht. What the farmer doesn't know, he won't eat.
Okay.
So I think that goes in that direction.
Yeah.
So Friedrich issued decrees. He has the famous Kartoffelbefehle, the potato orders. Also, fun fact, in German, potato is Kartoffel, and in Austrian German, well, in some parts of Austria, it's Erdäpfel. So, earth apple.
Ah, okay.
Like pomme de terre.
Yeah.
He instructed local officials to encourage potato cultivation because he just thought it's the safeguard against crop failures, right?
Sure.
And in some regions, officials were ordered to plant demonstration fields, and in others, potatoes were framed as an emergency food and not staple food. There is this often repeated story that Friedrich tricked peasants by guarding potato fields with soldiers so they would think it was very valuable, which is a very charming story, and I hope it's true, but it's most likely invented later. Anyway, the potato stuck, and over time potatoes became central to Prussian and later German food, and in retrospect, Friedrich became their symbolic patron.
Nice. I'm at least 80% potato. In fact, after this, I'm going to go eat some potatoes because potatoes. But before we go to eat some potatoes, we have one last macabre story to share with you. Friedrich's wife. What happened to Elizabeth Christine?
To the old cow.
What happened
who gained
to that
some weight.
old cow, Elizabeth Christine, who lived on, what was she spending? Like 5 million euros a month?
No, a year.
A year.
40,000 thaler, like
that's right.
Up to debated 9 million euros, something like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, she died on the 13th of January, 1797, at the ripe old age of 81. By then, she had outlived Friedrich by more than a decade and had spent most of her adult life separated from him. When she died, she was buried with all the appropriate royal dignity in the crypt of the Berliner Dom, alongside members of the Hohenzollern family. During the bombing of Berlin in World War II, the cathedral suffered serious damage, and for a long time, historians believed that Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevern had simply vanished in the devastating air raid that hit the Berlin cathedral. During the attack, the burning lantern of the cathedral's dome crashed down into the church interior, breaking through the ceiling of the Hohenzollern crypt below. It's like something out of a movie, isn't it, really? Elizabeth Christine's coffin was destroyed in the fire and collapse, and her remains were assumed to have been completely burned. For decades, that was the accepted version of events. The Queen's body was lost, erased by war, another casualty of Berlin's destruction. But then, in 2017, during restoration work in the crypt, conservators opened a coffin that they believed would be empty. Inside, they found something unexpected. A small zinc container. Inside that container were bone fragments. The zinc coffin is thought to date from 1944 or 1945, possibly from the final months of the war. Experts believe it was likely used as an emergency measure, a place where unidentified human remains from the damaged crypt were gathered and stored when proper identification was no longer possible. And so now, historians and forensic experts consider it possible, though not conclusively proven, that these remains could include those of Queen Elizabeth Christine. So, that's it. That's it. That is... I learned so much in these episodes, a very, very condensed episode about the life of Friedrich II of Prussia.
Yeah, like this is super condensed, obviously. Super, super condensed.
Yeah, I learned so much that I really knew very little about.
Same. I was highly fascinated by him, highly fascinated.
Yeah.
Because I said it in the first episode, for us Austrians, he's just this enemy figure, right? He took Silesia from us, and he pressured us into war, and, all da-da-da-da-da. But he was complex. He had a lot of negative sides, obviously, as well.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't really get into this one. I mean, except for the war, which was, normal.
Right.
For most of humanity, but other things as well. But he was an interesting character. Rather interesting character, I have to say. I really like his love for animals.
Yes.
I can really picture it. And I understand. I think we see this a lot in people who are really disappointed also by other people, by humans, that they turn to animals. Because, I mean, there's nothing like a dog's love.
No.
Nothing.
No one is ever going to love you as much as your dog.
Or your cat, or other pets. We're not saying that dogs are...
Oh, no, I'm saying
the only pets that will love you.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that. That's what I'm saying. I am saying it. I'm not saying that your other animals don't also love you in their way, but I don't think I think dogs love more than cats love. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I wouldn't say that they love more. I think, and that's what it comes down to when you listen to our episode about dogs and the history of dogs. I just think the bond between humans and dogs is a very special one. Let's say it like this.
I love cats. Don't get me wrong. No shade to cats. Yeah. Anyway. Do you have something good? Anything good?
You know what is my something good? This that when I find a topic, first of all, that I get super fascinated by it, and I tell you, and then you're immediately on board and say, yeah, let's cover this. And that then we can sit here and tell other people about it and hope they are as fascinated as we are. Because it is. History is so, and it brings so much joy. And I think people can always hear it when I'm especially obsessed with a topic. There's just a tone I have and I get when I'm super excited about something.
I love it. I think it radiates outward and everybody gets excited about it.
So that's my something good. What's yours?
Let's see. Ooh, can I rant about something real quick? Or explain something real
bad.
quick?
We didn't do that in a long time.
Something just came to my attention recently, and I don't know what they're calling it. They're referring to that thing where you're at the airport and you're waiting for your plane, and there are people who use wheelchairs to get onto the plane who then don't need a wheelchair when they get off the plane. And there's like a term for it, like miracle passengers or something like that. And there was this whole thing about it. I guess it's becoming a thing. And Paul was like, oh, have you seen this? And when I tell you the rage, so this is the one thing I just wanted to say super quickly. If you've ever seen this, you've heard about it or whatever, I'm not saying that some people might occasionally pretend to need a wheelchair to get themselves on a plane sooner. I mean, I'm sure that's probably a very tiny, tiny minority. The thing that people who see people getting on with a wheelchair and not using one to get off don't realize, and you know what? It's awesome for them that they don't realize why this is so often the case. The reason this happens for me is that when you arrive at the airport, very often it can take a couple of hours to get from where you've dropped your bags to where your gate is. It can take hours, and it can take hours of standing in lines, security lines, gate lines, depending on where you are. Depending on the airport, it can involve several miles of walking, like if you're in Miami or Atlanta. Depending on where you are, it is a long walk. And so myself personally, I only had to ruin one vacation because I didn't get a wheelchair, and the resulting amount of standing I did triggered a sciatica flare. And so that was just miserable. Now, when you get off a plane, this shouldn't be news to anyone who's flying and complaining about these people. But generally speaking, when you get off a plane, now it depends. If it's a giant airport, I will get a chair sometimes. But for the most part, once I'm standing up again, especially if it's a flight that's more than 2.5 to 3 hours long, I have to get up. It's going to hurt. It's going to physically be really uncomfortable to get moving, but I have to do that because my joints are so tight and uncomfortable. Also, the distance from plane to baggage claim, where there is usually a seat where you can sit down or an area where you can lean up against something, is substantially shorter than the line from dropping your bags to getting on the plane, like remarkably substantially shorter. So there are a huge number of people who need a wheelchair to get on, but don't actually need it to get off. They have to get those joints moving. And also it's a much shorter distance, much shorter. So can we please stop judging people for whether or not you think they need assistive devices? Yes. Just be super grateful you don't need one. Can we please? It's public transportation. Just everybody be nice. Mind your business. I was so shocked that this was a thing that people were like,
I never heard of it.
Yeah, like, oh, they're these Jesus miracle passengers. Look at all these people who need wheelchairs to get on but don't need one to get off.
What is it? Are they taking anything from you because they're on the airplane 10 minutes sooner than you? Like, really? Is that your biggest concern when you're going on vacation?
I know. The dream is to honestly be like one of the last people on, but in a time, you don't want anyone waiting for you, but you just want to walk on. You're in a hurry to get into the cramped plane with the stale air.
Yeah.
No. Like,
I'm always like hanging back and going on, like, I mean, depending on where I sit, because that's how they call the rules, right? But
yeah.
But the funniest are the people who are in a hurry to I'm always laughing. Funniest are the people who kind of hurry to be the first boarding, but then they realize, oh, we're not at the gate, we're with the bus.
Yeah.
And then they have to wait again for everybody else.
That's right.
Like, yeah.
So. Like, we'll see you at the baggage claim. We'll see you at the taxi stand. Yeah. Like, we're all trying to get...
We're all waiting, yeah.
We're all in this together. I've said this before, but it's like, we're just all in this together, everybody. And
that's it. And that's what we mean when we say, be kind.
Just be kind
to people. Give them the benefit of the doubt if they need the wheelchair or not. What is it to you, basically?
That's it.
Like, who cares?
It sucks having to ask for a wheelchair, especially in your 20s. There's very much, it's like there's this move it or lose it philosophy that I've always had. Like, wheelchairs are always a last resort for me. And I know a lot of other people feel this way, but it's also a useful mobility aid. Like, that's there to keep me enjoying my life the best I can under the circumstances I've been given. So, like, come on, people, stop it. Be mad about something else. All right.
That was a good something bad.
It was something bad. Sorry. Turn this into a 20-minute rant, but rant over. All right. What else do we need to tell them?
You know what? This has been long already.
Yeah.
Send us ratings, reviews, emails. Go to freshhellpodcast.com. Send us emails at freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Check out Patreon if you want to.
That's right. Thanks for liking and subscribing on YouTube.
Come and join us on Facebook.
Shout out YouTube people.
Hey, YouTube people.
Instagram.
And that's it. Please tell your pets we said hi. Hug them, feed them, cuddle them, cover them up, keep them warm. Be like Friedrich II with animals. I think that's a good role model when it comes to animals, at least.
Maybe just the animals, but certainly the animals. Yeah.
And be kind to them. Be kind to your fellow human being, airplane or not. Just, don't be an asshole.
Try not to be.
And be kind to yourself.
That's right. And as Winston Churchill once famously said during the Second World War, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.